Hi guys, hope everyone's doing okay and safe at home. I'm Aisha and I'll be talking about documentaries, specifically the idea of truthfulness in documentaries. I'll also be talking about documentaries about Singapore. So let's get this presentation started. I hope this works and you guys can hear me. And these are the things that we'll be covering today. The entire presentation, including the watching of a 20-minute documentary, will not take more than 40 minutes. So we'll be looking at what is a documentary, the definitions of what is a documentary, and then we'll briefly look at the types of documentaries and their examples. We'll also be looking at truth in documentaries, the idea of truthfulness in documentaries. Fourthly, we'll be looking at documentaries about Singapore. And lastly, we'll have some questions about the documentary we'll be watching together. It's by Darren So and it's called Before It All Goes. So first, let's look at what exactly is a documentary. If you look at the definition on the left, it's the simple definition. It says that documentaries bring viewers into new worlds and experiences through the presentation of factual information about real people, places, and events. The slightly more complex definition on the right talks about claims to truthfulness. Basically, according to this definition, documentaries adheres to a key tenet, which is to express basic truths. According to Bill Nichols's introduction to documentary, there are actually 6 types of documentaries. Bill Nichols is an American film critic best known for his contemporary study of documentaries. So let's go through the 6 types of documentaries first, and then in the following slides I'll show some examples. First up is poetic documentaries. Poetic documentaries actually aim to create an impression or mood rather than to argue a point. They emphasize cinematic values over content. Second is expository documentaries. These address spectators directly and adopt a voice of God commentary. Just think of Morgan Freeman narrating Net Geo stuff. Third is observational documentaries. This type of documentaries have minimal interferences by filmmakers. Filmmakers in this type of documentaries prefer a fly on the wall recording. Fourth, we have participatory documentaries. This is when encounters between the filmmakers and subjects are recorded and filmmakers engage with the situation that they themselves are documenting. Fifth, we have reflexive documentaries. These provoke audiences to question the how real these documentaries are and to question the form of documentaries in general. Lastly, we have performative documentaries. These give what it's like to be there type of perspective because the filmmaker is involved in the event or culture itself. Of course, just a point to note, there will be overlaps. It's not that easy to pigeonhole certain documentaries into just one type. But in the next slides, I'll share some examples so that this will be clearer. These are some examples, and the YouTube links were all working the last I checked, so feel free to check them out to get a better idea of these types of documentaries. So the first one we'll be looking at is Samsara. It's an example of poetic documentary. If you watch the video or the trailer, these are scenes that look like visual poetry. Okay, the second one is March of the Penguin. It's an example of expository March of the Penguin. Sorry, it's an example of expository documentary. It depicts the yearly journey of the emperor penguins, and it's narrated by Morgan Freeman, like the voice of God. And then we have War Photographer, which is an example of observational documentary. It uses footages filmed with a small video camera mounted on the photographer's SLR camera. This allows the viewer to see the events from the perspective of the photographer. It's like a GoPro view. We then have Super Size Me, an example of participatory documentary. The filmmaker is in the midst of investigating if fast food is bad for you, and he participates by using his own body as an experiment to see if eating fast food every day will cause him health problems. Just a fun fact, after I watched this documentary, I stopped eating McDonald's so much. Then we have Exit Through the Gift Shop. It's an example of reflexive documentary. It's about a street artist's rise to fame, and from the start to the end, it made people question if it's real or if it's a mockumentary or a hoax. Was the film just an elaborate ruse on Banksy's part? And then we have Paris is Burning. It's an example of performative documentary. It chronicles the ball culture of New York City and the gay and transgender communities involved in it. Why is it considered a performative documentary? It's because the filmmaker is in the midst of ball competitions and showing viewers what it is actually like to be in the midst of this type of competitions. And like I mentioned earlier, these examples can have an overlap in types as well. They could be hybrids. So now let's talk about the idea of truth in documentaries. Audiences like ourselves, we expect some kind of truth when we watch documentaries. We want to know that somebody's honest with their representation of reality. We want to know their experiences of reality. But there are some instances which makes you question the idea of truth. An example is the works of documentary filmmaker Michael Moore. He often gets criticized for bending the truth or manipulating the materials he has to argue his own case. Someone actually mentioned that he's positively brilliant at creating the false impression without uttering a single false word. So this just raises the question of truth in documentaries. For example, what is the truth anyway? Documentaries must be truthful to what exactly? To their own internal standards, or something that everyone universally agrees is the truth? There are also commercial considerations. For example, some versions of the truth could be sensationalized to sell documentaries. So some examples are all these crime documentaries that we're seeing on Netflix, as well as Tiger King, Don't Fuck with Cats. It's very sensationalized. The last consideration is, what truth do we share? Documentaries represent the reality that filmmakers themselves want to share. How can the filmmaker then represent the truth responsibly? There are many versions of the truth, and these are some examples of documentaries that may highlight this point. First one is Restrepo. It follows the deployment of American soldiers. We all know about the war in Afghanistan. We've all seen the images and read about the war in the news. However, a very important element is the voice of the soldiers themselves. So this is a film about war seen through the eyes of the US military men without any commentary. So it's up to us viewers to interpret the film and to draw our own conclusions of what exactly is the truth. And then we have Game Changers, which is a very popular documentary. It advocates for the plant-based lifestyle, and it highlights the health and performance benefits of veganism over a traditional omnivore diet. But there are actually many in the science field and doctors who have disputed the plant-based advantage advocated in the documentary. So again, versions of the truth. And lastly, we have Under the Sun. This film follows a year in the life of a family in Pyongyang, North Korea. But the Russian filmmaker who was assigned to do this soon realized that the entire thing is staged and scripted. So he continued filming after yelling cut to show the truth behind the scenes of making this propaganda documentary. So now let's look at documentaries specifically about Singapore. So most of the documentaries about Singapore, like Nat Geo's City of the Future and CNBC's Why is Singapore So Rich, these focus on how we are economically successful, and how we are a city of the future. There are also quite a few featuring our World War history. Well, it's true that we are successful economically. To reflect real life in Singapore, this cannot be the only narrative. There are also other truths about Singapore. These are some of the other truths. In recent times, we are seeing more documentaries on underlying issues in Singapore, such as poverty and homelessness. So these documentaries provide a narrative about Singapore that most outside of Singapore don't see or talk about. So Channel News Asia regularly puts up these documentaries or docu-series. Some examples are Don't Call Us Poor, a docu-series about life at the bottom of the society in Singapore. And then we have Going Hungry in Singapore, which highlights issues on hunger, which many people seldom associate with Singapore. There are also independent documentarians like Tan Pin Pin. She's a pretty prominent documentarian in Singapore. Her documentaries look at Singapore from a unique and different perspective. In Moving House, for example, she likens the exhumation and relocation of remains to a columbarium, and she compares this to Singaporeans moving to HDB houses due to redevelopment. Her other documentary, To Singapore with Love, looks at Singapore's political exiles. This documentary, with first-person accounts from the exiles themselves, is actually banned in Singapore. It shows a different truth to what we might be used to in Singapore, because it challenges the dominant version of the historical record. The documentary we'll be watching soon is called Before It All Goes by Darren So. It brings a new perspective to Singapore's constant redeveloping and demolishing of buildings. This process is usually viewed as a necessity in the name of progress, but this documentary questions that narrative and includes interviews with affected Singaporeans who advocate trying to keep our identity and heritage by preserving these buildings. So the documentary actually makes you question the sacrifices we make in terms of heritage and identity in order to make room for all this development. This again brings us back to the idea of truthfulness in a documentary. While there are common narratives that may be more prevalent in mainstream media, documentaries, as seen by the examples of Tan Pin Pin and Darren So, they can give us an alternative perspective and make us question if there is possibly more than just one version of the truth. Just looking at these two quotes on the redevelopment issue, one by Singapore's Prime Minister stating that these buildings were not built optimally and how it makes economic sense for the government to redevelop the site. And then you compare this to the other quote by Darren So, the filmmaker who wants to start a discussion on whether there's another way rather than, demolishing buildings over and over again. From Darren's perspective, the loss of cultural markers impacts both our individual and national identities. And his documentary, which we'll be watching later, will explore these questions in depth. I'll skip the slide. This is just for your reading pleasure. So now let's watch this video. You can look it up on YouTube. It's called Before It All Goes. It's just about 20 minutes long if I'm not wrong, and there are some real nice photography of Singapore's buildings included in the documentary. So I'm just gonna assume that we've all watched this 20-minute documentary. I hope you enjoyed it. It was shown at Objectives in August 2018. Maybe just a few questions to think about the documentary. After watching it, did you gain a new insight into Singapore, especially if you're not from Singapore? Did it make you feel a certain way about preservation of heritage and culture in general? The third question is, did it shift your perspective in any way. Personally, for me as a Singaporean, I'd always feel like we're moving too fast in the name of progress. That we run the risk of losing our identity. So this documentary actually resonates with me. I feel this need to preserve some things from our past, and feel like not enough is being done in this area. So we rarely see documentaries like this about Singapore, offering an alternative perspective aside from the usual how Singapore is an economically successful nation. So I was quite happy to watch it and share it with you guys. Um, Especially since I was looking at the idea of versions of truth in documentaries. So with that, I end my presentation. If you have things to share about the documentary or documentaries in general, you can just drop me an email. If you're interested to read up more about documentaries, these are some books I read and referred to for this presentation. If you have any questions or you just want to chat about the insanity that's going on in the world right now, please feel free to email me. I hope you managed to access this presentation and that it wasn't too much of a bore. With all this COVID going around, I just wanted to say stay sane, guys. Stay healthy. Take care. Bye.